The skyline of Thebes, a quiet and ancient landscape that once held within it the capital of imperial ancient Egypt. And our village, the village that made the royal tombs. A landscape in which life is still lived in the shadow of the ancient people. A landscape in which our ancient villagers went to market. This market, that has been held on the same day, in the same place for more than 4,000 years. Where the landscape and its people still hold the dignity and rhythms of ancient life.
شكرا بكره انتهينا؟ ايوه ان شاء الله ايوه شكرا. My friend asked me if I would come here again tomorrow to drink some more of his tea. And I told him I would, inshallah, if God wills. You can't do anything here without saying that. You have to say inshallah after anything. I will walk down the road if God wills. Tomorrow I will come to see you again if God wills. Everything is by the will of God. And this isn't just if I'm lucky. It really means if God will let you come. It's very funny here. If people ask you, do you have a God? If you're like me, you say, no, I don't have a God. People cannot understand that. And then they look back a little while and they said, but you say, if God wills, like we say, inshallah. And you say, oh, yes, but with us, that's nothing, if I'm lucky. To people here, it is very, very real. God is directing every moment of every day for them.
It's like that today in Egypt, and in a sense, it always has been. Consider the temples of the Nile and why they stand. Why kings that lived in mud brick rooms attended gods in huge chambers made of fine hard stone. The temples were links between heaven and earth, the lenses that pulled the universe into focus, and they studied Egypt with their mystical interconnections. Temples built upon the rhythms, the movements of the universe, with chambers that held the chanting of numberless lives absorbed in elegant pieties. And just as the temples held all the powers of the gods, so did the very landscape of Thebes. Here, beyond the western horizon of the city, is the Valley of the Kings, where the imperial monarchs were buried with the dying sun in tombs made and decorated by our village craftsmen. "1,500 years before Christ, they were already working here, generation after generation of villagers, quarrying, plastering, sculpting and painting these deep, mysterious caverns set in the valley rock. Tombs designed to sustain the kings of Egypt throughout all eternity. So let me try and tell you what's going on here, because this is the heart of the mystery. In a way, the center of the Egyptian universe. It's the place where the Egyptians reconciled death and life. The king's death, the state of Egypt, and the rebirth of the land every year with its crops, and the sun every day in the sky. And for death to be reborn, you need a womb. And the womb is the burial chamber of the king. You also need a mother. And the king sometimes is seen as the sun, who is arising every morning. And so here, you see the sun dying in the evening, going into the mouth of his mother, to pass through the hours of darkness, which is the underworld in these red dots, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on through the 12 hours of the night. At every hour there is a door, and at every door there is a demon, and you need the spell to overcome that demon. And then the king, after overcoming the 12 hours of the night, in his gigantic struggle, is born again between the thighs of his mother goddess over there, as Egypt is born every year on the Nile's flood, and every day at sunrise.
For the ancient Egyptians, the landscape was filled with the gods and all their powers. Sometimes the very cliffs and rocks were carved into the figures of the gods. And in the middle of this enchanted landscape, our villagers built a settlement in which they lived whilst they made the royal tombs, on the horizon between the valley of the dead kings and the living valley of the Nile. All the tombmakers slept here, and in the evening sat on stone benches and talked together. And here it is that we will find the hut of the scribe Kenhirkhopeshef. That's the house of Mr. Kaha. He used to make heart scarabs in there in his spare time for mummies. That's the house of his friend over there, I think. Yes, that's right. He used to paint little wooden plaques. And this then, that's right. This is the biggest house in the village, belonged to our scribe. Of course, there would have been a door there in those days. I've opened this way. Here's his bed. And this, yes, this is his office. See, it's the biggest, most important room in the village. The only one with a nice tiled floor. That means then, that out there, yes, there it is, that's his seat. I wonder if he was sitting on that when he was propositioned by his hairdresser. Scribes spent a lot of time having their heads shaved, as they wore elaborate wigs. But why would anybody want to bribe scribe Kenhirkhopeshef? Well, he was a pretty important man in the village. After all, he was scribe here for some 50 years. You've got to think that from this tiny little room, he sent letters out to the king, to the vizier, to all the officials of Thebes, to the villages, to the priests, just about everybody. He knew everybody. In a sense, he was Mr. Fix-It, especially at the village where he sat on the law courts and everything. He was a pretty big man. He was an unusual man, too, because he doesn't seem to have married till he was over 70. And when he did, he married a girl of some 12 years old. Actually, I think the young girl quite liked the old man. She had no children by him. She married again, another workman, and she had 7 or 8 children by a new husband. But her first son and her eldest, she named Kenhirkhopeshef after the old scribe. Close by their settlement, our villagers made their own shrine, and this exactly at a point from where they could glimpse the vast temple of Karnak, deep in the shimmering heat of the green valley below. Both shrine and temple were dedicated to the same god, Ammon, the king of the gods. But there were many other powerful gods in Egypt, such as Horus, here at his temple at Edfu. Now, Horus and his story are essential for any sort of an understanding of the ancient Egyptians. And here, his great family epic covers acres of wall. In this scene, Horus is on the right,
His mother, who is kneeling, is in the middle, and the man on the left is the king. Believe it or not, they're all attacking a small hippo who lies under the prow of the boat. Now this hippo is his uncle in another disguise. He's Seth, and he represents the forces of chaos and disorder. It's a good animal, really, when you think of this great sort of blundering beast that runs through rushes and busts things up and everything. They're attacking him because Seth is trying to get the kingship of Egypt. And he's killed the real king, which is Horus's dad, and Horus is therefore fighting for his legitimate rights. So this is a battle between chaos on one hand and order on the other. Now, the interesting and subtle thing about the Egyptians is they didn't only revere Horus as a representative of legalness and order, they also revered Seth because he's the other end of the tension which represents civilization. They even saw men of Seth in their own society. One of these at our village was a man called Paneb. If ever there was a man of Seth in the village, it was the foreman, buried in this tomb. And here he is, the old reprobate, Paneb himself. Actually, it's very difficult to talk about people like this because people tend to deliver rather over-quick moral judgments on them. And there's a man who drinks, who fornicates, who makes big rows, who makes trouble, but at the same time he's a very talented man. He's actually talented enough to run a gang of workmen and make royal tombs for some 20 years. He was much loved by his family, and by a lot of other women in the village too, for that matter. He got in and out of scrapes for a long time, but at the same time he kept the gang together for what, nigh 20 years through 5 royal tombs, and in that time they made some of the finest work in the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. It was very fortunate at this time that Paneb's gang held some of the finest stone carvers ever that worked in the valley. It was their fortune too that they were able to work on this beautiful, pure white living rock, because this limestone in this part of the valley is some of the best anywhere at Thebes. Now these people used their skills not to make dinky little patterns all over the walls in the manner of excellent craftsmen, but as thinking artists. Look at these beautiful broad shapes here. Normally, people with this sort of skill at their hands try to celebrate it all the time in complexity. These guys go for the reverse. They go for the large, long, meditative shape, a very simple form that nevertheless describes perfectly, say, this kilt or the curve on the leg in the simplest possible way. That, in a sense, is one of the supreme arts. It's the art of simplicity. This is an excellent example of their sense of design, for example. The king's arm comes down as a simple shape, turns into beautifully sharpened lines on the fingers, which again lead us into the water running from this pot. Sharp little black quivering lines that shatter over an offering table here that are resolved in 3 beautiful globes of fruit, very simply, and then flow down to the bottom, the tension all resolved. It's the sort of magnificence of design that you can expect only of the finest artists. And all the time, as you walk along, superb details, little throwaways of the artist's style. You can imagine, then, that in a community of artists, such skills and talents would attract a lot of jealousy, especially when Paneb made few concessions to respectability. This lively drawing has been taken from these fragments of papyrus, the celebrated erotic papyrus of Turin, which after years of dedicated study, scholars have successfully restored in all its rich detail. Now, we don't know for certain if the balding satyr in these pictures is Paneb or not, but certainly they were painted in our village and could easily have been inspired by his activities. Here, for example, he has fallen dead drunk out of his bed. Paneb wasn't always that amiable.
No one knows anymore why Paneb lost his temper one night, but lose his temper he did. And we do know that when he lost his temper, he came running down this street, went over these steps, up to this very door with a brick, and tried to bash in the lock to get to the foreman, who was standing terrified out of his wits on the other side of the door. It was an extraordinary evening in the village. It must have caused a great fuss. 9 men came and grabbed him and hauled him off, and it kept him all night. The papyrus that records the event says that 6 of them were beaten by him in the course of that. What an extraordinary man, a man who could keep a red rage up for hour after hour after hour. And this foreman was no just man to get angry with. He wasn't the boss of the gang. He was the very man who had adopted Paneb. So Paneb is showing this awful rage towards a man who is showing him affection and will continue to show him affection afterwards. Obviously, Paneb was a very difficult, emotional man.
Well, how did Paneb manage to survive and flourish? The answer's here in this royal tomb. Paneb's wonderful sculptures at its entrance are followed, deeper into the tomb, by these miserable drawings. The throne was weak. Little kings came and went, and in such dismal times, men with Paneb's talents often flourish. The drawings took, what, 5 minutes each? Yet they are the exact equivalent of these wonderful golden statues from the earlier tomb of Tutankhamun. And it was for stealing just such a statue that Paneb was eventually stopped.
So how on earth can you say with such confidence that you know about all these people that lived, after all, 1,200 years before the birth of Christ, people like Paneb? Well, they made things. They made hundreds and hundreds of stones that now are scattered through the museums of the world. It's by piecing all the information that they hold together that we can reconstruct their story. This piece, for example, is quite an important piece of family history. Also quite a pretty thing as well. You see here, on the top, there's a little drawing of fruit and vegetables. It was set up outside the tomb. And the family will come up and leave these little offerings here for the spirits, the dead. And I guess that when they poured the wine on here that ran down this little slot, went down there, that the wine they poured was date wine. Because, see, there's a pretty little palm tree here. So the person who was receiving this offering, the spirit of the dead person, must have quite liked date wine. Now here are the people sitting down. That one, this inscription tells us, is Paneb's own wife. That's one of the very few mentions of her name that we have. This one here, again the inscription tells us, is his grandson. And he is being offered to, rather unusually actually, by this figure here, which is Paneb's son, one of Paneb's sons. So the stela actually is a rather sad little document because it's showing us that the father is making arrangements for the spirit of his son, that his son had died before him. What's even sadder, of course, for Paneb's family is that little stones like this tell us that Paneb was killed for his crimes. And one of his sons ended up working in the mines for his part in it.
Being sent off to the mine was a terrifying fate for Egyptians, and unfortunately it was quite a common one in our village. In fact, it was so common that one of the scribes actually drew a map of the place. Now, it's the oldest map in the world. This is a copy of it. The original was about 10 foot long. As you can see, it's a horrible great black valley, and running through it, in a red dotty snake, is the road. At the end of the road, a red mountain, and that's what we're going to find. You know, there's only one place, really, that fits our ancient map, and that's here, the Wadi Hammamat. It's a strange place. It's a great road that runs from the Nile to the Red Sea. It's a 7,000-year-old road, at least. People have been coming down here that long. And I've just been wandering about the place, and I found all sorts of evidences, strange little things, the early travellers, I suppose. I found a piece of a stone pot. Could well be 3,000 or 4,000 years BC, that piece. I found a New Kingdom water jar from the period of our village here.
And the Romans, of course, lots of Roman pottery around this well, that's where they dropped. They were the people that put little stations through here and controlled everything very carefully. And of course you had to pay to go, it was the Roman Empire. And so we have a notice which says that in the reign of Domitian, for example, it cost 5 drachms for a camel to come down here. It cost 5 drachms for traders and for sailors at the Red Sea, and 20 drachms for whores. And that's a funny thing because one of the early Christians, a very saintly man, was coming down here, and the customs officer said to him, what have you got with you? And he said, nothing but temperance, righteousness and charity. And the man wanted to charge him 60 drachms because he thought they were 3 whores. Well, I'm sitting in the exact spot in the valley which is indicated on this part of the ancient map. Look, you can see the tops of the great black hills behind me. And very interestingly, see these pink dots? The ancients noticed that in the floor of the valley there were these coloured stones, these little pink stones everywhere. They put them on their map because they're really keen geologists, and that's what they're here for, stone. So they're likely to notice things like that. But there are other clues here to what happened to Paneb's son, and they're on the very walls of the valley. No. 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 None of these are the right texts. Look, I tell you how I can tell that. It's because of these shapes here and the signs that are in them, because these shapes, called cartouches, hold the royal name. They're called cartouches because the engineers that came with Napoleon's expedition thought that the shape was the same as the great wads of gun cotton that the armourers used to put down the barrels of the cannon to fire off the shot. But here, of course, in ancient Egypt, it's a simple little rope. And they always come in pairs, or usually come in pairs, but they always contain the name of the king. Look, I'll tell you how you can read this one. Originally, where that's a bit broken now, it was a little animal, a Set animal. And so the name reads Set, and this sign, E, so you have Set E, beloved, that signs mean beloved, of the god Ptah, and that's spelt out for you. These are just phonetic signs, like an ordinary alphabet. Ptah, the god Ptah, he of the beautiful face, the god of craftsmen. Every king liked to be beloved of the gods, you see. So, there's the name of our Seti in his cartouche, with a decoration of feathers above, and a nice little gold sign, another decoration really, but very appropriate for this mining area here underneath. But still, it's not the inscription of Paneb's son. We've got to go somewhere else to find what happened to him. Beautiful, isn't he? But it's not Paneb's son, it's Min, the god of the Western Desert. Oh, this looks like something. Right up here. Oh, blimey. Oh. Yes, that's it. Here's a cartouche. It's the king I'm looking for, Ramses IV. And there he is up there, you see, worshipping first Ammon of Thebes and behind Min of this desert. And this text is talking about the grand expedition the king organised here. It was a wonderful show. The high priest came, 50 other priests in attendance, charioteers, army squadrons, even vets for the horses. It must have been amazing. But the real grim work, the part that Paneb's son was in, was digging the stone for the royal sarcophagus. And in that work, of the 8,500 people who came here, 900 of them died.
It's in this awesome place that Paneb's son probably ended his days. It's really the finish of the village feud. Can you imagine sleeping in little rough huts in the desert? Stone here is so hot from the midday sun. You can feel it coming off your hands now. It's an extraordinary place. You imagine banging away day after day till the skin on your hands goes so hard that you can't straighten your fingers out anymore. They're just like receptacles to hold the tools you work with.
Paneb's son never worked in a royal tomb again.
You know, one of the most remarkable things about this map is not only is it the first map in the world, it's also a treasure map, because inscription on the end of it says, these are the mountains in which gold is quarried. And if you're very careful and look at the landscape closely, you can actually identify where the old gold mines were. You see, we've come up here through the grey mountains of the Wadi Hammamat, where Paneb's son worked. And now we come here into the red mountains. There are many different valleys running off, and this is a very unusual feature in the desert. We've got 5 exits from this little valley, and here they are on the map. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, if I'm right, the ancient gold mine should be quite close to this shrine, which is marked there, which means the actual shrine itself is just over there. So, I'm climbing what the map calls the Mountains of Gold. I'm going up to the shrine of Ammon, of the pure mountain. Well, this seems to be the oldest inscription in the place, and that's only ancient Greek. But I suspect this is the shrine of Ammon because holy places have a habit of staying on one spot for a very long time here. So, if we assume that this is the shrine of Ammon, and those mountains over there, according to our ancient map, the hills in which the gold was washed. And that road there, well, that's still the road that leads to the sea. That there, then, the ancient map tells us, is the mountains of silver and gold. And over there, behind that modern house, is the settlement of the gold workers. These gold mines in this area were the 3rd biggest in ancient Egypt. Nubia was the greatest. Gold poured in from there, mainly to plate the temples, some to go in the tombs of the pharaohs, some for jewellery of the court, indeed. But for the men who worked here, it was a terrifying experience. The work was long and hard, and I suspect thousands upon thousands of men died. As the ancient people were quarrying this terrible, hard granite for their gold, you'd expect them to be pretty economic in their mining, and they were. What they did, you see, was to follow these tiny little veins in the granite, which held the gold, tiny but very rich grains of gold, and that they followed deep into the rock until it gave out. And in fact, they were so efficient at quarrying these grains that when a few late Victorian eccentrics came back here to reopen the works, they went bust. There was nothing left for them. But in their time, of course, in the ancients' time, they provided tons and tons of the precious metal. Have you ever thought about that metal, how strange it is? When you think of all the gold that there has been in the world, and how most of it, over the centuries, is recycled generation by generation for its jewellery and its precious metals. And when you think that ancient Egypt used gold for plating huge temple walls, they had ton upon ton of it, gold like the sand of the desert, says the Bible, was in Egypt. It's highly likely that people now who wear modern rings have just a few flecks of Pharaoh's gold with them.
Pharaoh's gold was not, of course, money. There wasn't any in ancient Egypt. Gold was quarried to decorate kings and courtiers and plate temples, especially the Theban temples, the awesome houses of the gods on earth. And the gold that Paneb's son helped to quarry came here, to the temple of Medinet Habu, built in the 12th century before Christ, in the reign of Ramses III, the last of the great temples of the Theban Empire, and the best preserved. And by the side of these great stone temples were the mud brick palaces of the kings. So, through the king's private doorway into the corridor of his harem. Behind every one of these doors, a royal lady. Let me show you something quite interesting you don't usually see. One of the ladies' bathrooms. And look how practical it is. You see, the king's palaces were all made of mud brick, and it's a great material here in Egypt. But it's very bad with water. And can you imagine, as the two ladies stood here and poured the water over the king, how it would have splashed down him, run off, hit the walls, and brought the palace down in half an hour. So, the masons have faced his bathroom with wonderful stone. And over the top, they put a very hard, fine white plaster, even to stop the water seeping through to the mud brick beyond and bringing the bit down behind. It's a great bathroom, and it's far better than anything our village has ever had. So, this is the heart of the Egyptian state and the centre of the empire. It's the place where the expedition to the gold mines was worked out and provisioned, and it was here that the gold was brought after it had been quarried. It's the economic capital of Egypt. It's a very difficult concept to explain because the state works completely differently from any modern one. Imagine Gothic Europe, say, with a king and nobles, and the peasants who are working for the nobles and the nobles who are, in the end, supporting the king. Well, it's the same here, except the nobles are the gods. So the king, who owned all of Egypt and everybody in it, parcelled up the land to various gods. And the gods' priests then built their temples, and the priests took all of the produce of the land, offered it to the gods on the altars of the temples, and when the gods had had their fill of it, they gave it back to the priests, who used it for their own food and also supported the royal court on the side. It's an extraordinary idea. It also makes churches here, or the temples as they are, it makes them, if you like, the Westminster, the White Halls, the White House, the palaces, the offices of government, all wrapped into one. So around this temple, which after all is a holy place, we have the granaries of Egypt, the stables, the warehouses, the sculpture studios, and the priest houses. And the heart of all this, the temple of the god. And here, in the holiest, most sacred part of the temple, you'll find something you never see in a Christian church. A butchery, and a great bull thudding along in the Egyptian sunlight. Look at him, he's been kept in a stall all his life, especially fattened up for this moment when he's brought to the temple for slaughtering. They put garlands on him, ostrich feathers amongst his horns, and his hooves, you see, are curled right round because he's never walked before. He's really only existed for this moment when he's brought into the butchery and slaughtered. And in a sense, he represents the essence of the contract between man and the gods, because on the other side of this rule is a god's shrine. And so here you have it. Gods give men the food, men offer it back to the gods, and at the end of the day, on the altars, the priests take back the food and eat it themselves. The accounts of this vast sacred combine of some 70,000 people cover this entire wall.
And this part of the temple calendar in front of me here is the rations for the temple given to the god each day. That is collected from the temple warehouses that have been brought in from the countryside, put on the altars of the god and distributed back to the temple employees like the priests, the accountants and even our villagers. It's an incredible list. I'll show you how it works. Includes everything, of course. Includes vegetables and onions and herbs and bread, 8,000 loaves of bread. Look, here are the numbers, you can see them. See these little curls? They're hundreds. And these loops are tens. And those strokes ones. So we've got 365 daily. One that will be, of course, and then the product here. And all this column here, as I say, is all green herbs, lettuces, cilantro. This column here, it's so small, it must be some very pungent herb that you don't need much of. So this is really the list of wages, if you like, in an economy without money. And of course, our villagers would have got a lot of their food from here.
Our village tombmakers were civil servants, supported entirely by the state. This lady has baked loaves which would have been a day's ration for an ancient village household of, say, 8 to 14 people. And this was not all the food that the state provided.
Salam. Shukran, how is it? So, our bread was the last delivery, really, which makes up this display, which is really a family's daily ration at the village. Give or take a little, because our records are a bit wobbly, and also the Egyptian scribes are, because when they talk about bunches of things, they never actually tell you how much is in a bunch. What we do know, however, is that the basic ration is bread, the old ancient bread, and beer. I don't expect they got it in litre empties, like this. The beer they made was made of barley, this stuff. There was just under 4 kilos of barley delivered to the village a day, which makes about 10 litres worth of beer. Do you know there are over 70 sorts of beer in ancient Egypt? It looked much like porridge to start off with. I think pretty revolting to our taste, but then they added things to it. If you wanted to make yourself especially high that day, you could add dates with a lot of sugar in, or pomegranates to give it another taste. Well, I suppose they ate those freely too. If you really wanted a good heavy beer, you could mix it with pure flowing honey. Honey was the only substance that the village could actually produce themselves. They had hives up in the area by the tombs in little cylinders. And the bees, I suppose, would buzz down to other people's fields in the cultivation and come back to make their honey there. Vegetables, of course. I always think that Egypt's always had the best vegetables in the world, and these are some of their oldest. Onions, well, the basic reference for all of ancient Egyptian history is everybody's spirit begs to be given bread and beer and onions for an offering. Part of our standard villagers' diet, of course. The fish, well, we've given them rather a generous supply here, I think. On average, they seem to have got about half a kilo of fish a day per household, not much. So you might say then that as regards high protein food, this daily diet is a bit short. Of course, it would be supplemented by the cheese down there, that sort of goat's cheese. Now, this is not a bad daily diet, but then you think that our villagers also got meat, perhaps on average, every 3rd or 4th day in the year, the great feast days of the calendar, when herds of animals were driven up to the village for slaughter. These feasts were really the heart of ancient Egypt, the punctuations of the year. They were also the core of the religion. Because if most religions, I think you can safely say, set out to comfort people, to make them feel in a good place in the universe, at one with everything, the ancient Egyptians went about that, not by prayer and thoughtfulness, but by doing things. like building pyramids, an actual concrete link between heaven and earth, if you like, and by processions. Processions, after all, that are the same as the movements of the sun through the sky, through the gods through the heavens, following the moon going through the starry night. And these same processions took place here on the ground in Egypt. So just as the moon went through the night, so the gods of Thebes were taken from temple to temple. And those were the great celebrations of the Egyptian year. Everybody came to them, the villagers, all the people of Thebes. They must have been incredible, like an imperial coronation with regiments of soldiers from all over the Egyptian empire, dancing girls, everybody laughing and dancing. You see, the Egyptians, rather like their gods, weren't sober and they weren't prudish. For instance, they brewed a special beer at the time of the festivals and special bread. So by the time the priests who were carrying the god on a great sort of shrine, which they mounted on their shoulders, by the time they came out, they were probably in a pretty jolly state. So you can just see all of Thebes here, stamping and dancing and shouting in this marvellous exotic display, all ostrich feathers, gold, linen. Quite an incredible performance. So these are the temple butcheries with the priestly butchers carving away to get the offerings ready for the festival of opium, which of course they get to consume later on. You can see them, this one's laying on its side, so high, you see, it comes right up to there. These are his back legs here, tied together. And here's his tail at the back. This man's attacking his head, of course. Underneath, the meat's been prepared. It's all ready on an offering table. And there's a priest fanning away gently to keep the flies off of the meat. Here you can see it's a bit of a further along in the preparation of these offering tables. Got fruit here, cuts of meat, and the priest is pouring wine into a bowl, which is later poured over this great mass of offerings. And here are two priests working away on the final details. Again, the same sorts of offerings with the special bread baked for the festival there. And these people here are putting little bowls of fire in amongst the offerings, the famous charred offerings, the Bible. All these offerings were given up to the gods to the accompaniment of music, which rose through the temples rather like incense in a Christian church, a sort of medium between man and the gods. Here you see the temple priestesses. And they're shaking these magical rattles, have the face of the goddess Hathor on them, the goddess of love. And they had little bars of metal across them, and when they shook them, it made this magical tinkling noise in the temple. As well as music, of course, there's also dancing. Here are the dancing girls giving their all for the gods. And look how wonderfully the sculptor has drawn the hair in a beautiful natural curve. Here, we're coming up to the sanctuary of the temple, and you can see the final and completed offering tables. These are sort of side offerings here. These are great bundles tied up, papyrus stems tied up with the flowers hanging down and pomegranates and grapes. And you see the birds? Their tongues hanging out, they've been throttled, and their wings disjointed, stop them moving. And these would have hung on hooks around the sides of the offering tables, along with these beautiful bundles of papyrus, flowers and green leaves. Egyptians loved plants. This band originally, which is hanging from the main offering table here, would have had flowers and great necklaces all the way along it. The Egyptians used to wear those too. Here you see the main detail of a really beautiful offering table with dates, pomegranates, grapes, figs, and at the top again, bundles of papyrus. And all this exotic mess of food was heaped up and prepared for Ammon in the darkness of his shrine.
But not all times were good times. Soon, the higher walls of Medinet Harbour would shelter our villagers from bands of desert tribesmen. In his youth, King Ramses III had fought hard campaigns and taken thousands of foreign prisoners. After his battles, the hands of his Semitic foes and the uncircumcised penises of barbarian tribesmen would be cut from the dead, and royal scribes would compile lists of their numbers to be presented to the great gods of Thebes. But Ramses III had left Thebes to live in the delta, where he and his successors spent most of their time hunting the wild marsh bulls and building cool, glistening palaces. And the kings took the army with them. Old Thebes, rich in gold, years, age and indiscretions, would be left defenceless. It was also being threatened by natural forces. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Nile was being strangled as the lakes of Central Africa dried out. And for Egypt, the Nile is its life's blood. Without it, there is no life. Nothing. But this happened slowly, so slowly, in fact, that in the beginning, even the peasant that worked the land failed to notice. Gradually, more and more land had to be watered artificially. The river had to be carefully parcelled out to cover the earth. Year by year, the Nile gave life to less and less. Much of Egypt's land was slowly dying. The first effects of this were felt in the vast vaulted grain stores at Thebes, where stocks began to diminish. And for our villagers working in this tomb, the tomb of Ramses III, there were lean times, for with the government in the delta, a weak bureaucracy now ruled at Thebes. Month after month, as the men worked in this tomb, they saw their standards of living going down. The supplies were late in coming, nobody seemed to care, they complained, nobody did anything about it. Then one day, as they came in the morning, their indignation just boiled over and they walked right off the job. So, all swearing great oaths, as the papyrus says, the men climbed up out of the Valley of the Kings, went along this path down towards the Nile Valley, and over there to the Ramesseum, where they thought their food was being stored that they should have had, and where they wanted to stage a great protest. As the workmen came down here on their protest, you can't really say they were dizzy with hunger or anything, though they were angry enough to claim they were. What in fact was going on was that they were a body of professional craftsmen, and they felt they were being badly treated. They felt the priests were withholding the rations from the temples. They felt that authority had sort of forgotten about them, that there was nobody to complain to, and generally they were being neglected. It was really very much like a modern industrial dispute, in fact. What they were doing was going to the Ramesseum to sort everybody out. The men had walked off the job before. They'd never walked down into a temple, and they'd certainly never come right into the heart of the temple, which is what they were doing this time, right into the middle of the Ramesseum. And there they intended to stay the night. It was going to be the first sit-in in history. It's nice to think of our men coming into this courtyard, angry perhaps a bit at first, and then as the evening comes on them, sitting down in a little group in the corner, about 50 or 60 of them, all murmuring away and passing round the onions and the bread. And in fact, they won in the end. They had a few more strikes, and slowly the situation got sorted out and their rations went up again. Never as much as before, but enough to keep them going. But actually, there's something rather more significant than just winning a strike. They also lost a bigger battle because the community split. Because before in the valley, the scribes and the chief of police and all the important men of the village had always been absolutely at one with the community. But during the strike, they hadn't supported the men. This was something the men did by themselves. And so, in a way, you can say that it was the first time that there was a class division that opened in the village. It never went away.